Could we get some mics to start our conversation, please? And then we'll open it up. So, Shani, Alon, Carla, thank you so much for giving us so much to think about and to consider. Shani, I wanted to start with your presentation about using the institution as a space to positively affect and reconfigure how we're dealing with self, how we're dealing with identity, and how we're dealing with that kind of negotiation. And of course, the problematics that arise around trying to think about public and think about engaging with public in a sense that connects to a greater purpose. And oftentimes within this, curatorial work, we tend to forget the communities that we serve, and we tend to sideline and go beyond and probably think about other things that might, in essence, fall away from the core of what we're trying to really achieve. So I think that your practice is in many ways very, very useful and very much reflective of the space. And Alon, also moving into your practice of the Empire Remains shop and the humor, the sort of self-reflexivity, the way you're really, you and Daniel are unearthing a kind of history to complicate the narrative, to extend the narrative, to sort of make interjections that render us as people who are also complicit in this exchange and within this relationship to everything around us. So offering that level of criticality, I think, is important, because the unpacking of all of these things, the way our relationship to food, our relationship to wellness, our relationship to the economies that perpetuate this kind of relation is, I think, not only something that we should consider as people moving forward within this cultural space, thinking about critical ways to sort of to disperse and to interrupt, moments of thinking and moments of action. And then Carla, working with the land, working with a definite local context and these communities to re-engage and to assess how we think about ownership, how we think about agency, how we think about the inside and the outside. I think we have a lot to sort of unpack within the wealth of what you've presented. So instead of proposing a question to you, I would like to perhaps ask you, do you feel it sometimes impossible to be agents within your work? And if you have to negotiate that kind of freedom to truly emancipate your practice and to decolonize your practice, how does that look like moving forward? Or how do you work to activate that within the actual thinking of your projects and the work that you have to do on a daily basis?
Yes, so I think it's a really good point, and I think you made me think a lot about it in your presentation, because I think you brought very nicely kind of the two ends of the spectrum, right? This idea of the virus and kind of operating within and without the institution, and on the other hand, the mode of kind of generosity and the acceptance, kind of the expectation when we're working kind of in the cultural sector, for people to be generous towards the arts. And because I think this is kind of where we take a lot of time to think on the modes of operation and how do we work, right? What does it mean to produce culture today? And one of the huge problems we face as working as independent practitioners, like no backing, trying to bring together. I mean, we brought 40 people for this project from all over the world, right? And it was like completely independent. And one of the things is like you have to make decisions, like how do you work? And for me, one of the questions is like interns, right? Is something that is for me, it's a huge, huge problem. Like unpaid labor in the arts world today is a huge thing. Now, of course, very easily in London, with the influx of people that want to work in the cultural center, it's really easy to get interns. And it's really easy to have people working for you on such a project for free. But this is something that, like, from the start, and there's like no such thing, because what you are facing today in London, and I guess it's like you see it in many other places in the world, is that only people that come with a financial backing can work within the culture sector, right? Because only they, and I'm a product of that. I'm the product of that situation. I mean, I've been an independent practitioner for like over a decade, but still I know that if a crisis happens, I have parents that will not let me drown, right? And it's a huge thing. So how do we kind of start establishing the forms and the mode where we don't expect people to be generous, right? Because I think for me it's like, no, people should not be giving anything for free for us in order to produce our work, and people should be compensated and given money to produce. And I think it's like, how do we start to like create these structures that can allow that? And yes, it meant that we had like a part-time intern for like the duration of the project that started to work on the day the project started and like finished to work on the day it ended. And it was like extremely limited, like what we could do in that sense. And it was like a lot kind of fell on us, but still I think for that, this is kind of how do you really kind of establish these like modes of practice that really permeate into the project itself, right? And kind of it's, how do you stop creating the boundaries between modes of operation and the product, right? Which I think is exactly the problem of like colonial practices in many ways, right? It's this exactly the disconnect between these two spaces of how things are being grown and where are they being consumed. Right? Like how metals are being mined and how we're using them in the phone. We don't know. There's a huge gap we're living through until today.
So I think one of the things with working in an institution is, let me start this way. So for me, after I completed my first degree, I ended up in a museum of history and ethnography. And my whole academic work is based on an image I found in an archive working on a Museums as Memory project. But my return to the museum sector, to the cultural sector, is predicated on a kind of crisis that I'm having with my field, which is that in this age of anti-intellectualism, which chronically affects culture in Jamaica, in my opinion, that historians have a social responsibility to engage the public and require us to rethink the ways in which we construct our society or have national values. I think we have a larger responsibility. The historians who taught me were part of that generation who solo marked West Indian A-level history papers, taught all the existing Caribbean historians, tried to challenge curriculum construction. But you can't do it in mainstream academia. You can't do it because you have teaching obligations. You don't write a history that's accessible to the average person. What Liberty Hall requires me to do is to write a history that's accessible, to think about Jamaica today, but from the lens of the past, right? Jamaicans don't like to talk about slavery, but it's because we're walking with trauma every day. And we don't believe that we need to have a discussion about the kinds of trauma that we're having. However, I still have institutional obligations that don't that don't have space for sentimentalism. Right? It doesn't have space for my own kind of internal intellectual crisis. And for me, it is, and I'm really grateful for Donald for being trustful of my capacity to take care of the institution in her absence. But for me, I'm faced daily with this crisis. How do I produce a programming that fulfills the requirements of our annual reports, but at the same time accesses the community, finds funding, and still network, because we can't function without a network, and still maintain my own interests as a historian, which is to look at how information is being generated, accessing people who are doing exceptional work, right? And then make them accessible to everybody there, because we're still a public history education space, in a space that doesn't think that history can be public, or that can be tangible. And for me, after the 2 years of teaching, I've just kind of decided I'm not doing academic in the traditional sense, because I can't do what I want to do in the classroom teaching 50 people. It's just not going to happen. So.
And Carla, would you want to?
Well, as you know, I just started an institutional job less than a year ago, so I'm still processing the whole, I guess, armature of the institution, because I was independent for so long. And something that has stayed with me since I've read some of Olivier de Bross's writings was this idea of the double agent, which I kind of talk about a little bit in my paper, but it's like really like how do you need to operate in different ways and channel resources from different stratas and regions towards each other. So right now what I'm trying to think is like the ways in which I work in the Caribbean, how do I translate that into my institution and like incorporate that type of change? Like I'm like the only non-American or non-white person in my institution, so also it's like that's a huge challenge. But also at the same time, like there's a certain way in which this institutional job allows me some freedom and some resources to actually do projects in the Caribbean. So for this first project, Migrating Histories, our grant was I think it was like $2,500 that we did this project, and the rest was self-financed. I'm a member of WAGE and I pay the artist, so that I always have that in mind. But it's not a sustainable model. And I'm always thinking about how resources in the Caribbean, especially like some European institutions or US institutions, like really fund the same people. And I think that's a problem that is rarely spoken about. Especially Puerto Rico has like such a weird juridical political situation. For example, we're not considered a country after Prince Claus funds, so we can't access those funds. I mean, there's just a lot of there to unpack, but I'm still trying to think about how I can implement these collaborative practices and more into my institution, which is slowly happening, I have to say, but it's a tough road ahead.
Thank you. Yes, we're definitely opening it up for questions. Claire, do you want to?
Thank you so much. And of course, before any questions, a huge thank you for an absolutely outstanding panel as a whole and individual presentation. So, which of course can be said of all the panels that have preceded you. So thank you so much, and Holly for wonderful introductions. But riffing off what you just said, Carla, what I want us to think about is not just about how we can implement various practices of decolonial curatorship within the institutions we are fortunate to work with or partner with, but rather how we can entice these institutions to invest within our territories. And you might remember that yesterday I mentioned how, MoMA and DIA were starting to deterritorialize, their institutional, mission towards some of our territories. We need to be at the forefront of these initiatives to the extent that they may indeed serve our purposes locally. And this, of course, goes back to some of what the archiving panel was discussing, which is that who owns the archives owns history. So, instead of maybe, Shani having to go to the Smithsonian to get the Smithsonian to acquire or donate, how come the Smithsonian, comes to you rather than you having to go to them? And how do they invest within our territory? So I just wanted us to think about, how do we achieve this and how do we actually, shift the perspective on our relationship with these institutions? Not just us as being increasingly bought out to work for, but the other way around.
No, I think you're totally right. But I do think at the same time it's like a little tricky, for example, because you mentioned Klaus or MoMA PS1 coming to Puerto Rico, and I know for a fact that wasn't well received by the entire artistic community. So I'm thinking instead of opening a MoMA PS1 in San Juan, which I've heard rumors, I hope it's not true, but it's really investing in the institutions that already exist. Because then it's another colonial gesture. So I'm really concerned about these institutions parachuting in these contexts, and I think that has been a recurrent theme of the other tilting axis, as I know, and really thinking the ways in which they work in our region, and forcing them to do it and holding them accountable for it. Because I also think that in many ways these curators come and they're international and they have so much visibility, they have Instagrams and people want to be in their Instagrams, and it's true, they want to be in their social media. And a lot of artists need that visibility, they want it. So they're also very hesitant to be critical about it. And I think it's something that we need to sort of keep in mind and be more vocal. You can't just come here and do whatever we want to be in that dialogue, we want to be a part of the conversation.
I by no means want to suggest we should have, satellite MoMAs in our regions, but rather than indeed, as you said, we should hold them accountable to put resources towards our own, initiatives. So just to be clear.
And I don't really want to be too happy about Klaus Wiesenbeck visiting Puerto Rico, because he was on his way to Tania Bruguera performance that didn't happen, so he was stuck in Puerto Rico. That's the first thing, and we have to be vocal about it, and we have to say it. It was by chance that he was there. He wasn't interested in the first place. The other thing is that all of you, and I think it's very important, and it has been a reiteration all these days, is the ethics. That's very important. Who do we actually work for? Not who pays our salaries. Who do we work for? How do we communicate? What we communicate? And who do we work with? That's something that really bothers me sometimes, because I'm actually independent, but I'm also work with several institutions. How do you deal with that ambiguity, that I don't know, antagonism that we faced in our profession? How do you deal with that? This is more like an emotional question. How do you do that?
So, I think also following the last conversation, I think for me, and I think this is something has been coming up a lot, and kind of modes of operation in between the institution and the independent and the artist-led, et cetera, and I think, and how do we bring that into here and that into there, where I think for, in our experience, it's accepting that we're living through kind of an age of precarity, right? And in the age of precarity, there's no kind of possibility for stability in the same way we had, or kind of our parents had mostly. And I think in that sense, we have to start thinking of our initiatives or institutions as something that is responding to that, or working within that age of precarity, and is able to go through these cycles of having money one year and not having money the next year, and continue to operate. Because I think there's this idea of growth, and I was touching upon it kind of a bit, and we dealt with it in different ways. It's we have to for us, we're constantly trying, what does it mean to grow today? And what are we, like, towards what are we growing? You know, it's like, I think it's like, there's so much criticality towards kind of the modes of capitalism that kind of created this space. But then again, I think we're kind of so entwined and kind of in the race. So how can we really start thinking about it in completely other terms and develop institutions? And this is a conversation I think like Annalie and us, we have a lot. It's like, you know, that Annalie and I, you know, we have a ton of compassion towards that, you know, like she expresses a lot of her struggles and, you know, like what she's going through. And I'm like, you know, it's like, and then like Annalie, like the work you're doing is like, it's like a whole you know, it's like, it's an institution. It's an institution. It's what an institution would be doing in this, like in New York. And like you're doing it through this like very precarious kind of modes of action that change and move kind of between like a job now that I'm holding on a yearly contract that might continue and might not next year. But the work continues to, with that. And I think this is for me, like it's an incredible example for how I would kind of wish to think about kind of ways of practicing and production. And rather than trying to kind of, how do we kind of manage to make it, you know, and ensure that we have like another $3 million in our kind of institution for the next like 10 years or like whatever, I mean, or $10,000, right? I mean, it's like.
Well, I just want to thank Natalie and her staff at the National Gallery, first of all, because I said to Nasaria yesterday, it's like having little dumbbells in your brain at this conference. Because, you know, this is not a university, it's not a college, but this is the second international conference that we've hosted here at the National Gallery, so kudos to them. Because we need more of these spaces and more of these events for people to start really engaging intellectually and all of this kind of thing. But secondly, Holly, you mentioned being complicating the conversation. And Dr. Roper, yours really resonated with me because as a Jamaican who moved here as a baby, I'm black. You can't see it, and that's the problem. And that's the polemic a lot of Caymanians have, is looking around at all the Caymanians I know as artists and people that work here, no two are alike, even within the same family, because of intermarrying and all of that. It's all over the show. So I'm super interested in complicating in the whole Tilting Access thing as an artist and a Ministry of Culture worker, not as a curator, but, you know, how can I am black because I have McFarlane in my family, I have Cook in my family, I have Dr. Harold Moody, who I think ended up in London fighting for black people's rights. He's some 5th generation back. You can't see it though, and that's the problem. And so it's excavating that, and it's for the Caymanians excavating the slavery history, because they try and play it down sometimes, it becomes slavery light. It's like, oh, well, we had it, but it wasn't so bad. It's never not so bad. If it was one person, it's never not so bad. So just to say to everyone, and I'm sure we know because we're a bunch of creatives in here, that you can't ever look at any one person and just say, oh, is Simon more Caymanian or more American or more black or more white or brown? I have lots of first cousins in Jamaica, and they tell me they're called browning. I hadn't heard that term before because I've been here for so long. And, you know, this is a struggle I face every single day. I was called white cockroach. So you're at high school here. So you're talking about being called black as tar. I was called white cockroach. I had friends at university go, oh, she's cute for a black girl, about my cousins. So I've grown, like every single day, it's a struggle. I'm just saying that we should all just look at each other maybe and just try and see what's something that you can't see inside of somebody, because it's there. It just needs to be excavated or, deconstructed, unpacked, whatever.
I know we have to wrap up, but let me just say very quickly that part of the problem, and this is why I keep talking about the role that historians play, part of the problem is that we have to in the popular imagination, and I have very close friends from Barbados and Trinidad, so this is something that we've constantly spoken about, that in the popular imagination in our various countries, because we are always so caught up in day-to-day and surviving, there's a way in which we feel like our past has no implications for how we have defined ourselves today. And one of the things that we have to do is start being very honest about what happened during slavery. I teach adult students, and I force them to read Thomas Thistlewood because I want them to know that under our, and Thomas Thistlewood is a Scottish person who moved to Jamaica, lived in Westmoreland. He was an overseer. He was a sociopath. He raped every woman he's ever supervised. And he wrote about it. He has kept the longest diary ever on the region on slave society. And he documented everything he did every day. And it's over 60 years of writings. And it's used as a pivotal text in engaging slave society in the Caribbean because it's really the only comprehensive one. But I have my students read Thomas Thistlewood. I have them watch 12 Years a Slave. I have them watch Bad Friday. I want them to acknowledge that we exist in a society that is built on oppression and the of ourselves, and that the enslaver is also dehumanized in the process of enslaving. And we have to be very honest about it because we are societies suffering from deep hidden trauma. I mean, stories of the Holocaust talk about the genetics of trauma. So why can't we be honest about the trauma that we're suffering from? Because it shows itself every day in terms of how we interact with each other.
So I'm just going to change the conversation a little bit to go back to philanthropy and to funding and to put some responsibility in the room as to how we frame how we frame a new educated narrative around who a philanthropist is. We have a responsibility. Groups of 10s and 20s, starting from 1, can bring funding to the table. And I think that this is something that I have taken on, self-appointed, to teach my board and to teach people around me. When we need $5,000, you can give $100, however the math works out. And that's not something we talk about a lot. And in America, since that's where I'm homestead, and live and thrive, the Caribbean community does not turn up when we want money. We come for culture, we feed on it, we talk about the complexities, we talk about how it makes us feel wonderful, and we raise the flag under each nation. But we have a responsibility. We've lived there now 3 generations of us. And we constantly go to another well every time when we want funding. I want us to start saying, we can start putting forth money to do this. A $20,000 to Fresh Milk to fund a scholarship can be done now in this room. And we have to feel empowered to do it. And I think that we need to have a session among ourselves about how it is that it's done. We grew up with Partner in Jamaica, where your parents sent you to your summer camp on a Partner, all through the Caribbean. And I want us to have an intimate conversation with money and not to be so afraid of it, because we all need it. And there's a way our communities are wealthy and abundant, and we have to step up to the plate and change this conversation just a bit.
Yes, Rosie, I completely agree. That sort of accountability and that responsibility of showing up, engaging, and giving is something that it's the only thing that would provide us with a way forward out of this mess, right? Because we keep on coming back and circulating and speaking about the same thing every time we meet. So over lunch, and I know we've sort of gone over by 20 minutes, maybe we can start to unpack this for our breakout session this evening, because it is something of value for us. Thank you all. Enjoy lunch.